Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of Classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. Today's episode is a conversation, and I'm speaking with Adam Keene. We previously published another conversation with Adam and myself here on the podcast, and this one that you're about to hear was recorded before that one, sometime last year. And this is a wide-ranging conversation in which I get a little bit personal about my own journey, for those who are interested to hear that. And we also engage in some rapid-fire Q&A, I might say, exploring a whole bunch of interesting questions about Classical Tantra, neo-tantra, hatha yoga, and more. It's quite an engaging conversation, I think. We also cover things like the Yoga Sutras, reincarnation, digesting experiences to resolve them, connecting to the subtle body during a yoga practice, yogasana practice. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I did. And as I mentioned in the previous conversation with Adam, he is a prominent teacher in the world of Ashtanga, and I appreciate him because a lot of Ashtanga teachers, not all, but a lot of them are perhaps not so interested in the depths of the tradition and the fact that Tantra was a direct precursor to Hatha Yoga, which is itself the precursor to modern postural yoga. So we unpack some of those threads here. Enjoy.
So today on the Keene Yoga podcast, we have Dr. Christopher Wallace, eminent academic, scholar, philosopher, and non-academic practitioner and scholar. So what does that stand for, Christopher? Let's unpack that first of all.
Oh, yeah, I guess it just means I publish in academic peer-reviewed journals and books, and also non-academically, and I teach in non-academic contexts, and sometimes invited to give lectures in academic settings. So I'm just managing to bridge both worlds. I was on track to be a university professor, and I decided I much prefer to teach practitioners in the modern yoga scene, especially, and just enjoy the freedom that affords, not being in the academic box and tied to a specific department at a specific university. So yeah, that's kind of what's been going on for a number of years now.
I mean, I mentioned that because I think your work is very precise, very good, very well researched, and also, it's very clear that you're a practitioner as well. So you're really one of my favorite people, somebody who's a scholar and a practitioner. And there's a few. Jim Mallinson, who comes on the podcast quite a lot, being another one. I know we said that we might cover this at the end, but would you give you have an interesting background. Would you mind just going through how you got into the whole thing in the first place briefly, just to introduce you to the listenership a little bit?
Yeah. So, my parents were into alternative spirituality, especially of Hindu varieties, though they wouldn't have used that word, Indian, Eastern spirituality and philosophy. And so, for example, my father took me to Rajneeshpuram in the 70s, as just a tiny little kid, and before that all blew up, right? And he took me to meet Swami Muktananda, in California, and that's the tradition that my mother ended up practicing quite intensively and seriously, which is Siddha Yoga. Um, and so with that lineage particularly, so I was exposed to it a lot. I was hearing Sanskrit mantras from a young age, and then around about 12 or 13, I rejected it all, as one does, reject whatever one's parents are into. And then some years later, at 16, I got slightly interested again and attended a meditation intensive, a one-day meditation intensive, and had a powerful experience, which was sort of like an initial awakening, um, just at the end of it. Not expecting it. It certainly wasn't priming, because I was mostly opposed to everything I was hearing, and yet by the end there was this sort of kaboom, a gentle kaboom, right? That opened me up and to a wider, broader, deeper kind of experience than I knew was possible, and so that was a crucial turning point. And so then I started in as a practitioner, and had this sort of weird double life that people who practiced at a young age can probably understand, where on the one hand I was like the altar boy at my local meditation center, and going to all uh, the events and everything, and even there at like 5 a.m. on some days or whatever, and then also exploring psychedelics and out late at night with friends, and falling in love, and
Mm.
exploring the body and sexuality, and like, so it felt like a double life a bit for a while, especially because the meditation scene that I was involved in, Siddha Yoga, was and is very conservative. So it encouraged that split. So in a way, many years later, when I discovered the deeper teachings of classical tantra, which were quoted in Siddha Yoga but never explored in depth, right? But when I looked deeper into those teachings, it provided a way to understand the holism of this kind of spiritual seeking, meaning to say, someone who's meditating on the one hand, but also doing psychedelics on the streets at night, and exploring sexuality and all this stuff, that this is actually part of a single project that you don't even realize, that intuitively you're seeking the deeper meaning, or if there is one, to reality as a whole, and that deeper meaning must be inclusive of all aspects of ourselves,
Mm.
so not just the higher transcendental instincts, but also the sensual, and so on. And so in retrospect, I was seeking in various ways. But only non-dual tantra provided a context to understand it in that way, that spirituality doesn't need to exclude sensuality and sexuality, and whatever else, even though it also provides a context for a kind of discipline rather than hedonism, right? Because that's required to make those explorations productive and meaningful, right? Rather than just attachment to peak experiences. So, in fact, I've never talked about it in quite that way, but there's a reason that as I delved deeper into non-dual tantra, which became my specialty, non-dual classical tantra, um, that it always resonated with me, even when it contradicted or conflicted with the teachings that I had grown up with. So
Mm.
there's sometimes we have this experience, we find a version of the spiritual path that speaks to us so deeply that we feel an internal yes, even when it's contradicting something we were raised with, which you would think would be stronger. But there's this deeper knowing that wants to be met by a spiritual path, and that's what happened in my case. So I gravitated over time, over years, really, um, to the teachings of non-dual,
Mm.
classical, Shaiva, Tantra, keep giving a fuller name to it.
I don't know whether I've ever heard what kind of lineage or teachers you studied with.
Yeah, well, a variety,
Mm.
Paul Muller Ortega, who's still out there teaching this same sort of thing, though in a different
Mm.
way. Um, and a couple of other teachers who, uh, well, one who's not a public figure, one who I prefer not to name, but then I also found teachers that happened to be very much in accord with non-dual tantra, like Adyashanti. So
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I like
so
him. Yeah.
yeah, his teaching
Mm.
is very much in accordance with non-dual tantra in various ways, though it doesn't cover all the same ground, needless to say. Um, but I felt this, and I even corroborated this feeling by giving him a copy of Tantra Illuminated, which he read, he told me cover to cover, and he agreed that his experience of the nature of reality and awakening and consciousness really tallied, as it were, with this teaching that he'd never even heard of. He'd never read about classical tantra's version of non-duality,
Mm.
which is different, right, from Vedanta and from other versions. So yeah, so he was a teacher and a mentor, and eventually something of a friend, um, and he helped me actually uh, unpack the transmissions that I'd already received, because my first teacher, my root guru, um, she she gave me so much, but in a non-intellectual way, in a more energetic way, a direct transmission in person, really powerful transmissions that I can't, even begin to explain in words. But it felt like other teachers like Paul Muller and Adyashanti and others were needed to sort of unpack those um, transmissions that I'd already received, and help me integrate them more fully, understand
Mm.
them more fully, as well as further transmissions that occurred with Adya, and also with the past masters, as it were. So in this tradition that I study and practice, the idea, one of the ideas is you can also receive transmissions from those ancient masters who are not here in the body, but who are still living forces.
All right. That's
You
a
know,
bit Madame Blavatsky, isn't it? Yeah.
well,
Letters from the
except
ceiling.
no, because there's no claim like
Yeah.
she claimed, oh, I've got the message word for word from the ascended masters, right? And what I'm talking about is more like when I study the words of Abhinavagupta, who lived a
Mm.
thousand years ago, that they come alive in this vibrant way that's
Mm.
again inexplicable unless you've had the experience. So not that Abhinavagupta speaks to me, and I've got a direct line for new teachings from him, but rather that his energy is alive in his words for me in a way it's not for someone else. Someone else could read his words in Sanskrit or in translation and get nothing and feel, what's this guy talking about?
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know. So that's what I'm referring to there.
I'm going to ask you because I don't know whether I'll get another chance to chat to you.
Sure,
Did
sure.
you
Any
ever meet Tony Parsons? Tony Parsons in London. I used to go and see him a lot, and I know you
No,
go to London sometimes, so oh,
no,
you
I've
should go
heard
and
of
see
him.
him. He's in Hampstead. Yeah, interesting guy. I'd like to see a conversation between you two. Be interesting.
Cool.
Yeah. Um, anyway, what about Tantra then? Like, I think some people are going to have misconceptions about Tantra. You mentioned in some of your videos the difference between neo-tantra and classical Tantra. For people that don't have any idea about Tantra, and it sounds, like, obviously it sounds rather alluring, right? Oh, you get to do whatever you want, and you get the meditation as well, and you get to have sex and drink and do whatever you want, like. So, what exactly, is it true? Is it the best of all worlds, or, is it a little bit more tricky than that?
Well, yes, yes and no. I think it's the best of all worlds, but if you do not engage the practices and all your behaviors with great discernment, then you don't get to experience what they're talking about, what the tradition is talking about. You don't get to actualize the goal, So if it's a pretext for just doing whatever you like, then it's not a spiritual path at all. It's just a hobby or something that you know show off right to others, like, oh yeah, I'm a tantrika or whatever, and that means anything goes because it's all God. So we would say that the people who represent the classical tantric path, that that's not engaging the path at all, right? Because there's this incredible discernment that's cultivated and required. um, but yes, it is also true that it's not a religion, and it's a spiritual path. It's a way of engaging spirituality that is all inclusive, that excludes nothing, that doesn't have some kind of moral code that applies to everyone, and yet you are required to cultivate great discernment about what is beneficial and what is non-beneficial in any given circumstance. And the reason there's no 10 commandments or moral code is precisely because what's beneficial in one circumstance is not in another, and what's non-beneficial in one context is beneficial in some other. So the sensitivity to context is what makes tantra different in a way. It's not saying that all actions are equal, or any. So people get confused about the meaning of the word non-duality. Like they say, oh, there's no good and bad, so everything's equal, so it doesn't matter what you do. That's not at all the teaching. It's that actions can be extremely beneficial or extremely harmful in a given context, and then when the context changes, that changes the nature of the impact of the action. And so it's a path that requires a lot more carefulness, consideration, and thought. Because if you've got a religion that just says do this, don't do that in all contexts, period, then it closes down. It closes down thinking. It closes down sensitivity. So you're just supposed to do what you're told, and context doesn't matter. So this is very, very different in that sense.
It seems to, yeah, I'd say it seems to demand a lot more individual responsibility, and also you'd think then that without a kind of general kind of moral or teaching, included in a book form, for example, you'd need a particular relationship with an individual. Like it prioritizes a particular relationship with a guru or master who can kind of help you differentiate, because it's very murky water, and as you well know, and there are many people, famous tantric practitioners, Chogyam Trungpa, or the like, who seem to go off the rails a bit. It seems to be a little bit volatile, and you can take a wrong turn fairly easily, get yourself in a lot of trouble.
Yes, yes. The idea being there that somebody who's not complete in their process, who has a very high attainment, as people call it, right? They can still end up going off the rails, and Trungpa is an example. Now, it depends who you ask, of course. If you ask disciples of Trungpa, he never went off the rails. It was all just a play. It was a personality display. He pretended to be an alcoholic and a drunkard, but it's
Well,
but it's hard to hold that line when, he died in a mess from alcoholism, right? But certainly we can't deny the power of the teachings that he gave some years before that, um, though to my mind, they're not always the most coherent teachings, even at his peak. So I would side with those who say, oh, this was a brilliant advanced practitioner who wasn't complete in his process of integration, and whose compulsive tendency got the better of him before he could complete his process, right? So I would not say, oh, look, here's an example of somebody who
Mm.
shows that Tantra permits you to get drunk every night and still be a master. I would say that's not what we're seeing there. Was was there another question that I forgot back there a bit? Or
No, I mean,
okay.
perhaps not. Perhaps I'm just kind of trying to kind of get a clearer grasp on the ideas
Oh
of
yeah,
tantra for people that are, you know, that are
yeah,
kind of interested in playing with it, and you know, maybe you could just say where they might start to look, and is it related? I mean, but kind of like sidelining into hatha yoga, which is essentially our interest on this podcast. Does it relate to that at all? You know, does it
yeah.
have similar roots? And right, yeah.
This is a big topic, but when trying pedagogically, when trying to help people understand any large and complex topic, you're considering, well, what's
Mm,
the best entry point to start unpacking it? And so the best entry point is not comparing classical tantra to neo-tantra. The best entry point is comparing it to Tibetan Buddhism, because Tibetan Buddhism is, for the most part, tantric. That is to say, it's based in the tantric scriptures, the Buddhist versions thereof, because Tantra was a spiritual movement that began in Shaivism, the religion of Shiva, the deity Shiva, and his consort Shakti, and it propagated from Shaivism into Buddhism and Vaishnavism and other religions as well. And so already by the year 600, you had a fully tantric version of Buddhism that flourished in India, and then propagated to Tibet a bit later. So Tibet received Buddhism in an already tantric form, as
mm,
opposed to Burma and Thailand and so on, that they received Buddhism in a pre-tantric form. So Tibet received this tantric version of Buddhism, and it became
right.
in Tibet highly monasticized, meaning it
Mm,
existed in the domain of the monasteries. So it's a monastic version of tantric Buddhism, um, which of course means that any teachings on sexuality, for example, are secret teachings, advanced secret teachings only for those who've passed all the levels of initiation and so on. But if people want to know what the classical Tantra is, we could say it is in many ways quite similar to Tibetan Buddhism, except remove the cultural idioms that are uniquely Tibetan, remove the monastic elements, because in its original form, Tantra was a non-monastic tradition intended for, literally designed for, householders, people like you and I, who have
mm,
relationships and careers and houses and so on, right? So that was the original purpose of Tantra as a yogic path, a yoga designed for householders, which was a new thing at the time, 1,500 years ago. It was a totally new thing, because yoga was exclusively for
yeah,
renunciates,
yeah.
for sannyasis, for various sorts of renunciates and monks before Tantra. So that's why Tantra is also uniquely relevant to people today, because all the way down to the early modern period, it remained the only form of yogic practice that was specifically designed for householders. So you mentioned hatha yoga, and I'm just emphasizing the correct pronunciation there, so I so rarely hear it, right?
Sorry.
But no, no, go ahead.
that's that's my bad. Let me just ask you quickly: is there evidence that it was fully formed within India, then it goes out to Tibet, and then it comes back? Right? There's
Yeah.
clear
Oh,
evidence that it
yes.
was.
Ample,
And
ample.
why does it do that?
It's not that it came back. Well, it did come back in the 20th century, but no, it's that Tantra is existing in India in all these different forms: Shaiva
Yeah.
Tantra, Buddhist Tantra, Vaishnava Tantra, and so on, right? And it just so happens that it's tantric Buddhism that reaches Tibet, because Buddhism is proselytizing. It's trying to spread itself, whereas Shaivism and the others, they're not trying to spread themselves, right? So tantric Buddhism reaches Tibet, reaches China as well, and reaches
Mm, mm,
Japan in altered forms, right? And it's part of Shingon Buddhism in Japan. And but so then it flourishes in Tibet, right? While the Muslim invasion is devastating northern India, wiping out Buddhism completely, uh, uh, very much impacting every other spiritual and religious tradition in India, but not completely wiping them out. So Shaiva Tantra was more grassrootsy than its Buddhist equivalent, and so it was able to survive the Muslim conquests and continue in this attenuated form. Okay, so and some of those tantric teachings that were around fed into early hatha yoga, which was a much simplified practice. Hatha yoga is a simplified yoga compared to full-fledged tantric yoga, and that makes sense in the new context of Muslim domination, because now there's not the funding, there's not the patronage from the state, and there's not the institutional basis for evolving much more complex forms of yoga. So that's part of what's going on there. And so all the way down to the present day, Tantra in its Shaiva form, or Shakta Shaiva form, continues in India, but more and more and more attenuated. So it almost didn't survive to the modern period, but it just barely managed. And now we're seeing a revival in the context of globalization, where people are like, oh, this is very interesting, right? But as of, let's say, 100 years ago, the tradition had almost died out in its various forms. Um, eh, so again, I'm painting with broad strokes here. It already sounds complicated, but it's actually much more complicated than that.
Is there any precedent to say that modern hatha yoga is anything to do with the original kind of, say, Buddhist Tantra iterations you might see in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra or the like of that? Is there any relation to, or is it just, the 20th century just kind of conjures up a completely new thing?
No, no, no. Some people think that, and some people read Mark Singleton's book Yoga Body in that way, and
Mm.
they're reading it wrongly, and Mark would say so, that even though modern yoga is a product of globalization, even though the influence from um, Danish and Swedish gymnastics and calisthenics is very, very strong, and British Army calisthenics is there, and all this stuff. It is a globalized phenomenon, modern yoga, as practiced today and as practiced for the last 90 years. But it also has very strong roots in a flourishing Indian tradition of embodiment or physical culture, that also almost died out. It almost died out under British rule, but it barely managed not to. And so Krishnamacharya and his teachers were certainly looking at these texts. They didn't have access to good editions of them, but they were looking at texts like Dattatreya Yoga Shastra and but even more so Shiva Samhita and
Mm.
Hatha Pradipika and so on. So these texts contain tantric elements, and also modern yoga, has all these tantric teachings woven into it that people aren't aware are tantric teachings. But a couple of examples.
Mm-hmm.
um, the teaching of the unity of all life, or even the unity of all things, right? This a non-dual teaching that we're all connected, or we're all one in some way or another, or that all living beings are inextricably interwoven with each other, so the fate of any being affects all other beings in some way. These are tantric teachings that we see appearing in modern yoga. We don't find them in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, right? We don't find them in non-tantric sources, right? But not only that, the teaching, for example, the body is a temple, or the body is the temple of God. Explicitly tantric teaching. Again, not at all found in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, where we see almost the opposite idea, actually, a need to reject the physical body in order to lose one's attachment to it, right? So in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, when correctly translated, which is rare, you're advised to cultivate disgust towards your own body and the bodies of others. And in Tantra, you're advised to look upon the body as the temple of the divine. So very stark difference there, and modern yoga has the tantric teaching, despite the fact that it cites Patanjali Yoga Sutra much more often. So there's this kind of profound confusion.
Yeah. Why do you think it is that the Yoga Sutras has become the preeminent text in, for the budding yoga student on the teacher trainings, etc.?
Yeah,
Why is it that
well,
it's so popular?
uh, this is actually well understood by scholars now, so it's not just my opinion, because under the British, in the British period, in British India, education was controlled by the British. And so every educated Indian was British educated, right?
Mm.
So this was part of colonialism. Colonialism was an extremely powerful force in the culture, right? Mostly negative. So what that meant was that people weren't studying the tantric sources because they were mixed up with sexuality, sensuality, weird magical practices. All sorts of weirdness was going on there that the British Sanskritists were not keen on, not happy about, right? And so there's a whole history to this, right? But the person who influenced the development of Sanskrit studies more than anyone, and who wrote the Sanskrit dictionary, Sir Monier Williams, he said, "Oh, these tantras, they don't bear thinking about. They're mere manuals of mysticism and superstition and da, da, da." So anyway, um, what we had was a context where, for educated Indians, there was a lot of kind of pressure, cultural pressure, to focus on sacred texts that had the approval of the colonial masters. So those included the early Vedic hymns, and this is a big reason for the lionization of the Vedas in modern Hinduism, even though people know virtually nothing about them. And also other texts that are clean, right, that don't have any weird elements. And so Swami Vivekananda, in the 1890s, he was looking around for, like, what text can I base some of my teaching on that will appeal to Westerners and educated Indians? And he landed on the Yoga Sutra, even though the Yoga Sutra was not studied anymore in India, meaning to say, there were no native scholars of Patanjalian type yoga left in India. The Yoga Sutra was virtually dead as a text. The last commentary on it had been written centuries before. Um, This is all documented, by the way, in David White's biography of the Yoga Sutra book.
Mm.
And so the reason, interestingly, the reason that Vivekananda chose to comment on the Yoga Sutra was precisely because he could give it a new modern spin, and no one would contradict him because no one was really studying that text. So he brought it to the Westerners and the educated Indians. Oh, look here's a wonderful text about meditation and the pristine nature of consciousness when separated from the problematic world of the body. And indeed, he was successful in sort of rehabilitating the text. And this is at a period when people like Vivekananda, who are appealing to Westerners, were utterly rejecting hatha yoga and any kind of physicalist yoga, right? So likewise, not long after him, Yogananda would also minimize or sideline or reject physical yoga. And so but then little by little, this other stream, started coming in with people like Kuvalayananda, who was Krishnamacharya's teacher, one of his teachers. Kuvalayananda in Maharashtra, right? He was advocating for no, actually, we don't need to reject the physical body. We can take these hatha yoga materials and rehabilitate them too. So you have, for example, Krishnamacharya, who originally was only, the founder of modern postural yoga, basically. He's only looking at hatha yoga texts for a long time, and then little by little starts bringing in the Yoga Sutra because everyone else is talking about it. So only late in the game did he say, oh, yes, this is important, Yoga Sutra. And then his son, Desikachar, of course, highlights it quite a lot. So we have this revivalism concerning the Yoga Sutra for culturally specific reasons, and really all to do with colonialism. So for those people who are interested in this project of decolonizing yoga, then this is all very, very interesting. And so if you ask the question, which I think is a very important question, so what would yoga today have looked like if it hadn't been for colonialism, if it hadn't been for 3 centuries of, 2.5 centuries of British rule? Well, it would be much more explicitly tantric, right? Because even though the glory days of Tantra were long over by the early modern period, you had a lot of tantric themes surviving in some of these hatha yoga materials, such as Kundalini at the base of the body, rising up, penetrating the chakras. This is a tantric theme which appears prominently in some hatha yoga sources later. And just a really, really interesting scene, circa, let's say, the 1600s, right on the eve of colonialism. I'll just mention one fascinating example. A teacher of mine published an article called Patanjala Yoga is Nonsense, quoting, the title is actually quoting a 17th century indigenous writer who, in fact, is emphasizing sort of tantric sexual practices very explicitly and rejecting these body denying yogic practices, whether from Patanjali or from hatha yoga. He's arguing against these bodily mortification practices and so on. And so he's explicitly saying there in the 1600s, writing in North India, Patanjalian yoga is nonsense. This is not the way. In fact, we want to integrate our sensual and sexual experiences with our spiritual life and experience the highest bliss. You're not going to get the highest bliss from this rejection of the body. So that was very explicitly happening right on the eve of colonialism. And indeed, we know that British local rulers oppressed and persecuted tantric groups that were engaging in sexual practices. So it would have been very, very different indeed.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's an argument that's coming to the fore more, and I have heard it before. I think it's very good to give it more airtime because, yeah, the Yoga Sutras doesn't appear to be a particularly helpful practical guideline for the modern yoga practitioner. So, what is, what texts are, and how would that look like in terms of the contextualizing tantra or the hatha yoga practice one is doing? What kind of framework would be more helpful in terms of integrating exactly aims and then incentives towards it, rather than aspiring to follow the yamas and the niyamas more correctly, whatever that means.
Well, first, as a side note, let me say that we don't want to denigrate the yamas and niyamas. In fact, they also appear in some tantric sources, even expanded
Mm-hmm.
lists. So, in one important tantric source, we have 10 yamas and 10 niyamas for 20 total, an expanded list of more discipline and more attention to your behavior and what's beneficial and what's not. So those are important in the tradition, and they are considered part of the foundational groundwork that you lay, as a practitioner. So you can only you're only free to dispense with these guidelines that can be seen as moral guidelines later on when you're a more advanced practitioner. Having said that, what texts would be more appropriate to center in modern yoga teacher trainings, for example? I would say those scriptural texts that teach yogic practices and are body positive, right? So, as opposed to yogic practices aimed at transcending the body, getting out of the body
Yeah.
in various ways, right? So, and we find exactly this in tantric texts. We find an embodied version of yogic practice, a cultivation of the body. Why? Because there's different end goals
Mm-hmm.
envisioned, right? So in Patanjali, the end goal envisioned is a complete disentanglement from the world of embodiment, from the physical world, a transcendent state of consciousness that becomes permanent, leaving the body in
Yeah.
the material world behind. And in Tantra, the ultimate goal that's envisioned is called Jivan Mukti, and that's, of course, liberation in the body, liberation while living. So an embodied liberation that requires no rejection of any aspect of human experience, right? Which, of course, doesn't mean that you approve everything equally. It doesn't mean that you celebrate everything. It just does.
Mm.
You're not required to reject or exclude any aspect of experience whatsoever, right? Which has nothing to do with a kind of universal approval. Right,
What
it's not.
happens when you die then in tantra? I mean, it doesn't. It's like a working conclusion, but it doesn't offer a full conclusion like the transcendental idea that you just kind of manage to get out of the cycle of reincarnation.
Yes, well, this is interesting because um, in tantric teaching, if you become jivan mukta,
Mm.
liberated in this very body, in this very life, then you are freed from the cycle of reincarnation. You're not part of that anymore. But also, they refuse to say anything about what happens when you die, right?
Hmm.
It's that you are the infinite, and then the body drops, but there's no, certainly you can tease out implications from the teachings. The implication is clearly there, that there's going to be no persistence of anything like individuality when the body drops, because individuality has been dispelled as an illusion, right? Even while consciousness is seeing through a body, the sense of being an individual, a separate self, is completely obliterated in this condition of Jivan Mukti. And so, of course, there's not going to be any kind of persistence of individuality, of anything like a soul, of anything that could reincarnate, right? So, uh, what's even more kind of problematic or confusing is like the status of reincarnation in light of the fact that a soul is not a separate entity in a non-dual tradition. Meaning to say, if you've got a
Mm,
dualistic
mm,
tradition, the soul is a monad. It's a unit of consciousness which
mm,
transmigrates. First, it's in this body. Now it's in a new body, right? But in Tantra, you don't have that. You don't have the notion that a soul is a monad or separate unit of consciousness. In fact, the word soul is used sort of metaphorically for a condensation of the one universal consciousness that never ceases to be separate, never even becomes an it, right? So this there's just an illusion of individuality from the fact that um, to use a better metaphor, if you have the ocean, right? A bit of the ocean can come into a new configuration, so you can get like a whirlpool in the ocean, like when currents are colliding in a particular way, temporarily you get a whirlpool. And whirlpools can even last quite a long time if the currents feeding them are steady, right? And you could name that whirlpool. Say, there it is. There's the such and such whirlpool. But it's never anything but the ocean. It's never anything but the water of the ocean in a particular pattern, right?
mm,
But it has a locality. It's localized. It's here, not there, right? All the water of the ocean could feed through that whirlpool eventually. In the same way, then, that's what you and I are in our true nature. We're just a configuration of the universal consciousness, a localized configuration, but with absolute non-separateness in this exact same way as the whirlpool in the ocean. So that therefore the soul doesn't even exist as a unit, and therefore reincarnation is understood in this different sense, rather than a soul transmigrating. It has to do with the momentum of a karmic process. Same in tantric Buddhism as in tantric Shaivism, different terminology used, but essentially what's understood is that there's a momentum, there's a kind of arc, right, to a particular configuration that spills over into a new body, right?
mm,
So a matrix of desires and unresolved karmas and
mm,
so on
mm,
this whirlpool formation on a deeper level than the physical spills
mm.
over into a new body, but that doesn't suggest that there's a separate self.
It was a bit of a tangent, but that was a relevant tangent. And the first time I heard the whirlpool uh, metaphor, so a nice
Yeah.
one. I think people enjoy that. Did you make that one up? Is that yours?
No, I mean, I don't know who did it. It's one that gets used here and there by non-dual teachers. I think I
Right.
might
Okay.
have refined it a bit, but there's nobody laying claim to it. It's
Well,
such a
trademark it.
perfect
Yeah,
metaphor.
that was a good one. Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, just thinking, to kind of wrap this up as we head into the closure of our interview. I mean, how would the tantra then, like, better contextualize and kind of basically aid people in their own hatha yoga practices? Because many people practice asana practices every day. They don't seem to have clear aims and objectives about them, what they're doing, what they're meant to experience, what the goal is, basically. I mean, you mentioned, in one of your interviews, basically that you're a seeker of truth. Now, that seems a little bit, of a kind of a naive thing for people to think these days, that they're looking for truth, right? Like, how often do you actually hear someone say that these days, right? So
Mm.
how, like, could you kind of overview, like, how one might integrate some of these ideas into what one's doing on a yoga mat?
Yes. Okay. And in answering this, I also want to touch on the bit we left unanswered from before. This bit about which scriptures would be
Exactly.
more
Yeah. Yeah.
appropriately centered in a modern yoga practice. And I just want to give one example, which also touches on this new question. Um, in the Vatulanatha Sutras, for example, which is a tantric text of only 13 sutras, so much more digestible than Patanjali's 193 sutras, right? But in this text, we have this fascinating teaching on three primary centers of the body, which, when experienced in their fullness, release three kinds of sublime experience called nectars. So these
Mm.
nectarian experiences are possible through going deeper into these three primary centers of the body. One being the Muladhara region, referring there not to just a chakra, but the whole region of the body from the pelvic floor to the low belly, right? The core of the body in that region. And we're invited to explore that and how it relates to the formless ground of being, and how it
Mm.
relates to the underlying most fundamental vibration of reality, called the Mahanada, the great resonance. And so there's more detail to that teaching. And then we're invited to focus on the heart. And what's interesting in this text is the female body is seen as the default practitioner, which you never get in Hatha
That's really
Yoga
strange.
sources or
Yeah.
non-tantric
Mm.
sources. Yeah. So in this particular text, or in this teaching, the female body is the default, and it talks about the breasts and the milk in the breasts as a metaphor for the nourishing quality of consciousness that we access by going deeper and deeper into the heart space, deeper than the emotions, into the sacred heart. And and it's a very lots of kind of explicit somatic metaphors are being put into play, and that through interiorizing awareness in the body is part of how we're doing this meditative process. And then the third center being in the head, and so there's a whole teaching on that, which I don't have time to get into, but the resolving power of consciousness located in the head is to be meditated upon. And so this whole beautiful teaching that invites this exploration of the inner world somatically and subtly and energetically. And this is what could make people's practice on the mat more meaningful, is that
Mm.
they're entraining more and more the subtle body, the energy body, and even deeper levels within themselves. Um, and they're interiorizing awareness, not just in terms of the tissues of the body and the muscles and the connective tissue and so on, but in terms of the subtle energetic reality that's getting um, touched into when we actually do some of these poses, if we allow for it, right? Because there's a way of doing the poses mechanistically. There's a way of doing the poses almost in a dissociative manner, that doesn't touch into the subtle body. So if there's this
Mm.
willingness to access our emotional reality, our emotional world, and the world of the samskaras, the unresolved experiences from the past, if there's willingness for that, then we do, in the poses, in the physical poses, we can access some of these unresolved experiences and allow for their resolution. And that's another reason that these tantric texts, like the Recognition Sutras and the Vatulanatta Sutras, are so appropriate for modern practitioners, is this huge emphasis on digestion, on
Yeah.
digesting our experiences. So instead of just transcending the ego, transcending the body, we are to look deeper into the body, find the unresolved experiences, and resolve them. So feel the pain that was unfelt before, and allow it to resolve. Feel the joy that was unfelt before and allow it to resolve. Digesting the remnants of incomplete experience from the past. This is a big emphasis in these sources. And this digestion allows you to be more embodied and more alive. So
Mm.
Patanjali talks about burning the samskaras, and Tantra talks about digesting the samskaras, assimilating the energy locked up in unresolved experiences and judged parts of ourselves, and thereby becoming whole within the body. So that's an opportunity that's there, and that's so often missed, so I would love it if modern yoga teachers would encourage their students, hey, when you feel emotions, coming up, take a moment and be with that. You don't need to move on to the next pose when I cue it. We don't need to have everyone doing the same thing all the time, because sometimes something's coming up and you need to be with it and totally give yourself to that experience so it can resolve itself. That's just one little example of how we could make the yoga classes more helpful to the spiritual goal of true holistic experience, where we become not partitioned, no longer internally divided. Most people experience, oh, one part of me wants this, one part of me wants that, I'm torn all the time. The goal, if you want to articulate the goal of yoga from a tantric point of view, it is to be internally undivided and then be undivided from the world. No more artificial divisions, a total holism, an embodied holism that yoga can help make happen, and that many people are sort of missing that golden opportunity in today's world.
I mean, it's very interesting, and again, in the context of the ideas of modern trauma-informed yoga, that there is actually this this ancient precedent for that, which was great, and that was a really, really good explanation. How then? I mean, obviously, you've got many practices that you do personally, but how then does the asana practitioner kind of take that, what they've done for a little bit of time in the morning on the yoga mat, and take that and kind of contextualize it in their day if they want to, if they're serious about, being an aspirant or, a practitioner of a sadhana? How would that relate?
Mainly by dissolving this false separation, whereby we have spiritual practice in the morning for an hour and a half or whatever it is, including or asana practice, whatever, and then the rest of our day we have, so this is problematic from a tantric point of view, to separate experience in this way. So what we would do instead, you can still have a morning practice, of course, to set the stage for your day to be a bit better, more open, more relaxed, whatever. But more importantly, that you weave practices throughout your day, a little bit here and there. So a dedicated practitioner, ideally, is willing to say to people, hey, you know what, I need a moment. I'm going to exit this conversation for a few minutes and go somewhere and get into their body and, cry some tears or scream some script, whatever needs to happen, because sometimes what's happening now in the present taps into something old, which is unresolved. And if we push that back down because we got to just get on with what's in front of us, or the current conversation, we're doing ourselves a disservice, right? So by it can just take 10 minutes of getting into the body, using your training because poses, stretches can help open up something that's locked deep in the body, in the hips or wherever, or in the heart, and then just let some of that flow, and there's a kind of catharsis that can happen, and I'm oversimplifying the process in the interest of time, and then you return to the conversation, but now you're carrying a little bit less of that burden from the past, which influences how you see the present. So that's one example. And other forms of micro meditation, where you're dropping in for a few minutes here and there throughout your day, that would be, the shift that I would call for, to allow your practice to be more effective and to learn from the wisdom of the tantric tradition, which evolved for hundreds of years before Muslim conquest and before British conquest, and then got sidelined and sort of almost deleted from the history. And so that's why we're trying to bring it back, because there was this organic evolution that was really getting somewhere, and then got cut off. And only now in the modern period, we're getting back to some of this, like this thing of digesting what people are calling trauma, is so much a part of the of the tantric tradition, except they
Mm.
say you can do it more quickly than you might realize by not making a self out of it. Instead of thinking of yourself as a traumatized person or a wounded person or a victimized person, you dissolve those self-images, get intimate with the emotional energy itself, and allow it to dissolve into the very core of your being, into your central channel. It's a whole beautiful technique for this. But this is a way of what they call hatha paka, sudden digestion or forceful digestion. The same word hatha is there from hatha yoga. So hatha paka, sudden digestion is possible of even very old trauma through this technique. And so this is something that the tradition has to share with some of these people who are doing this work in the modern period. And it's some really fascinating stuff. For those who want a written reference immediately, chapter 11 of the Recognition Sutras, my second book, gets into this in some detail. And then one of the chapters of my new book about to come out also gets into it a bit. But the reference that's available for you there now is chapter 11, Recognition
All right.
Sutra.
And I also recommend looking at Christopher's YouTube videos, and there's a lot of stuff on ego and shame and how to deal with different emotions, and it's very, very good. And now I wish that we spend the whole time talking about that. And well, he's hard to get hold of, but
you can do another
I was
one.
going to say, like, people, if you enjoyed this with him and you partition him or me directly, then maybe we can get him on for a second round, and we'll talk about but a little bit more practical stuff, because he's a lot to say on that, and I found it personally very, very helpful. So thank you. And just to wrap it up, Christopher, I suppose let's just ask you about your new book. What's going on with that, and just give a brief overview.
Well, it's coming out in just a couple months, and you can pre-order it now. It's called Near Enemies of the Truth. Well, actually, by the time this podcast is up, it'll be almost released, maybe. So it comes out, it's published on November 14th, and it's called Near Enemies of the Truth. And it is a different sort of book for me, because I've done deep dives into tantric philosophy and practice. But this book is aimed at a wider readership, and it's explaining why the platitudes and spiritual cliches we hear all over the place are misleading, but what the deeper underlying truth that they almost point to might be. So platitudes like you create your own reality, listen to your heart, follow your bliss, everything happens for the best, or everything happens for a reason, these and more. The universe is sending me a sign. There's so many. So I explore these, and I show how they're popular because they're close to a very deep truth that's hard to articulate in words, and that believing the bumper sticker versions is not ultimately helpful, and exploring the more nuanced reality that they almost point to is much more beneficial. And that's what I try to do in the book, as well as getting into hot topics like what is the ego? Do we need it? What is non-duality? What's the
that sounds excellent.
These sort of things. So it's a more accessible book. The language is more accessible. There's almost no Sanskrit. It's
really good.
And it's shorter and lighter and easier.
Yeah, I mean, I've read some of your more academic papers, and they are definitely for a select market, but that sounds fantastic, and for everyone, I'm looking forward to that. Thank you. That's brilliant. And obviously we'll link in the show notes to website and other information where you can catch Christopher. Just to finish, Christopher, I'm kind of on a personal level quite intrigued, so I'm going to ask you my standard questions for podcast guests as they finish the show. Can you give me an inspiration, something that inspires you? Could be a person, a place, or blah blah blah, whatever. And let's say, this is a brilliant one for you: a guilty pleasure, because obviously you can't have any guilty pleasures.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Anyway, these are the two questions I've asked people over 100 times. So I'm going to ask you the same, and then we'll finish. we'll wrap up
there's
the
no
chat today.
there are no
There is no
guilty pleasures, but
brilliant.
perhaps people are a little surprised to learn that a spiritual teacher enjoys bourbon, But in fact, it's so interesting
That's a good one. That's a good one.
because I do enjoy bourbon, but actually a tantric teacher from Tibet, a Tibetan master, wrote a book called "The Guru Drinks Bourbon?" which is addressing exactly this issue of like how projection onto teachers is dispelled by in various ways. But anyway, so there's that. The inspirational one. I mean, there's so many inspirations. I'll mention Rupert Spira. I think is a wonderful teacher who's popular today, and I'd heard his videos on YouTube a bit, and I thought, oh, this guy's talking about truth. Yeah,
Yeah, he's been on the
like...
podcast. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, but I didn't know how deep he went. I just heard some stuff on YouTube, and I thought, yeah, this is talking about the same stuff I talk about. But then I heard some meditations that he gave on retreat, I think, that are not on YouTube, long form meditations, like an hour each or longer. And I was blown away, like because this guy has such an intimate embodied understanding and experience of non-duality and can transmit it. And so when I discovered that not long ago, that became an inspiration for me. Just a beautiful way of languaging the total undividedness of experience, and pointing to the fact that everyone's already experiencing non-duality. They just don't realize that they are, and so it needs to be pointed out. And so I'm glad to say I reached out and got in touch with him, and he said, "Oh, I love your book, The Recognition Sutras. I feel like we're already old friends," and so made a new connection there.
He's a lovely guy. So gentle. I felt like I came across incredibly brash talking to him. I don't regret that, but he was such a sweet guy. I just have to qualify. Bourbon, by bourbon you mean American whiskey, not proper whiskey. Is that what you're saying? You say you prefer Jack Daniels to like Glenfiddich or a proper whiskey. Good. I've got to clarify that. Right.
No, okay. I hate Jack Daniels because that's not a well-made bourbon.
We call whiskey, right? Yeah.
Yes.
We're not talking about any blended thing from the US.
A single malt Scotch, aged for 12 years. If it's I don't like the peaty kind, to be honest. But also, I love American bourbon that's properly made, unlike Jack Daniels. So that it's a delicious thing. But anyway, we can talk about that more in person
on the next session. We'll start with that on our next session. But it remains to be said. Thank you very much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure, a fantastic interview, and I really do hope that people will request another session so I get to talk to Christopher again. Please get his book. I'm certainly going to get it, and links in the notes below. Whatever. Thank you, Christopher. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga, guided meditation, and much, much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Grazia Tribulato. New episodes drop every week, and may all beings benefit.